"Ma'am, you might want to look outside." The flight attendant's voice wasn't loud, but something about it cut through the soft hum of the airplane cabin like a quiet alarm. Several passengers turned their heads. A few people leaned toward the windows. One man in the row behind leaned forward so suddenly his tray table rattled. "What the hell is that?" he muttered under his breath. Outside the wide oval window, high above a blanket of clouds, sleek gray fighter jets glided through the sky in flawless formation. They weren't distant shapes either. They were close enough that passengers could see the markings on their wings, close enough to feel the vibration in the air as they paced the commercial aircraft like silent guardians. For a moment, the cabin filled with murmurs, confusion, and the uneasy thrill that comes from witnessing something you don't understand. The young woman by the window barely moved. She sat upright in her seat, wearing a simple light pink t-shirt and light denim jeans, her brown hair tucked neatly behind her ears. Her hands rested calmly on her lap. She looked out the window with a quiet expression that didn't match the panic building around her. "Those are military jets," the man behind her said loudly, leaning forward between the seats. His voice carried the tone of someone who believed he knew exactly what was happening even when he didn't. "Something's wrong. They don't escort commercial flights for no reason." A nervous laugh rippled through nearby passengers. Someone whispered that maybe the plane had wandered into restricted airspace. Another passenger quietly pulled out a phone and started recording. But outside the window, something even stranger was unfolding. On the back of one of the fighter jets, a uniformed soldier stood upright, steady as a statue despite the roaring wind. And then another jet moved into formation. Another soldier stood tall. And then, almost impossibly, several soldiers lifted their hands to their helmets in synchronized salute, not toward the plane, toward someone inside it. The man behind her frowned, confusion twisting into irritation. "Who exactly do they think they're saluting?" he scoffed. The young woman still didn't react. Her eyes stayed on the horizon, calm and reflective, as if she had seen skies like this before. And maybe she had, because somewhere far below those clouds, in the middle of endless rows of cornfields and dirt airstrips, there had once been a call sign whispered across quiet runways, a name that pilots didn't forget easily: Viper. Before the story goes any further, take a second to subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be heard. What the passengers on that flight didn't know yet was that the quiet woman sitting by the window had spent most of her life being underestimated, and the sky had never forgotten her. The cabin settled into an uneasy silence as the fighter jets maintained their formation outside the plane. Some passengers stared in fascination. Others shifted nervously in their seats, whispering theories that ranged from military drills to emergencies. But the young woman by the window remained almost completely still. Her name was Emily Carter, though most people around her didn't know that. They just saw another quiet passenger on a routine flight somewhere over the Midwest. The man behind her leaned forward again, his curiosity turning into a kind of restless confidence. He wore a crisp green polo shirt and carried himself with the easy authority of someone used to being listened to. His name was Daniel Hargrove, though he had already introduced himself to half the people in his row during boarding. "I've flown plenty of times," he said loudly enough for several passengers to hear, "and I can tell you right now, this isn't normal." Emily glanced out the window again as another fighter jet drifted closer, its metallic wings reflecting sunlight like polished glass. Her expression stayed calm, almost thoughtful. Daniel noticed that calmness immediately. It bothered him. "You're not worried?" he asked, leaning forward so his voice reached her seat. Emily turned slightly, offering a polite smile that didn't carry any tension. "Should I be?" Daniel scoffed. "Military escorts usually mean something serious." A few passengers nodded nervously. Emily simply looked back out the window, her eyes following the motion of the aircraft. For a moment, the soft roar of the engines outside pulled her mind somewhere else entirely, somewhere quieter, somewhere filled with open farmland and the smell of summer wind across tall cornfields. Years earlier, Emily had learned to fly on a narrow dirt strip carved between acres of family farmland in Iowa. There were no fancy hangars there, no radar towers or bustling terminals, just an aging crop duster, a battered windsock, and a father who believed the sky belonged to anyone brave enough to respect it. Most people called it reckless. Her father had called it freedom. Emily remembered the first time she held the controls. Her hands had been small back then, barely reaching across the instrument panel. But the moment the wheels lifted from the ground, something inside her had settled into place. Flying wasn't just a skill, it was a language, and she had understood it instantly. The quiet hum of the plane brought her back to the present. The jets outside shifted again, maintaining a precise distance from the passenger aircraft. Daniel leaned forward once more, unable to hide his irritation. "You know, people are nervous," he said. "A little reaction wouldn't hurt." Emily turned her head slightly, her voice calm. "Panicking usually doesn't help situations in the air." Daniel frowned at that answer, as if the calmness itself was an insult. He glanced toward the window again, then back at her. "You some kind of pilot or something?" he asked with a sarcastic chuckle. Emily's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Something like that." Daniel laughed under his breath and leaned back in his seat, shaking his head. To him, she looked like a quiet young woman on a regular commercial flight. The idea that she could have anything to do with the precision flying outside the window seemed ridiculous, but outside, the jets held formation with unwavering discipline, and somewhere among those pilots, a call sign had just been recognized, one that hadn't been heard in years: Viper. The tension in the cabin thickened slowly, like the air before a thunderstorm. Passengers were no longer whispering quietly. Now people were openly leaning across seats, pointing phones at the window, trying to capture the unbelievable sight of fighter jets pacing their commercial flight through the sky. The sunlight reflecting off the clouds made the aircraft look almost unreal, like something from a movie. But what unsettled people most wasn't the jets themselves, it was the soldiers standing on them. Perfectly balanced, steady despite the impossible conditions, raising their hands in sharp, disciplined salutes. Daniel Hargrove leaned forward again, his earlier confidence fading into confused frustration. "That can't be real," he said half to himself. "There's no way they'd be doing something like that during an escort." A few nearby passengers nodded, but no one could explain what they were seeing. Emily Carter continued to watch the horizon quietly. Her expression softened slightly as the nearest jet adjusted its position. She recognized the formation pattern instantly. It wasn't random, it wasn't aggressive, it was ceremonial. Her mind drifted again, not to the cornfields this time, but to a very different place. Years ago, she had stood on a concrete runway under the blazing Texas sun, wearing a flight suit that still felt too stiff across her shoulders. Around her were pilots who had grown up dreaming of fighter jets, men and women who had spent years climbing through military flight programs. Emily hadn't followed that path. She had come from a farm runway where crop dusters buzzed low across rows of corn. To many people in that program, she was an outsider. But the first time she took an advanced jet into the air, something changed. Her instincts weren't just good, they were extraordinary. One instructor had watched her land after a complex maneuver and quietly said something that stayed with her for years. "You don't fly the sky," he had said, "you listen to it." That was the day she earned the call sign, Viper, not because she was aggressive, but because she moved with calm precision that struck faster than anyone expected. Back in the airplane cabin, Daniel's voice cut through her thoughts again. "This is ridiculous," he said. "If the military's doing some kind of stunt, they should at least explain it." Emily finally turned her head slightly toward him. "Sometimes explanations take a little time," she said, "especially in the air." Daniel studied her face for a moment, trying to place something about her calm demeanor that didn't fit his assumptions. But before he could say anything else, the cabin lights dimmed slightly as the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." The chatter stopped immediately. Even the phones lowered. The captain's voice sounded measured, but there was a note of careful professionalism behind it. "You may have noticed several United States Air Force aircraft maintaining formation with our plane. Please remain calm, we are not in danger." A ripple of relief moved through the cabin, but the captain paused before continuing. "We have just received confirmation from the escorting pilots that this is a recognition flight." Passengers looked at one another in confusion. Daniel frowned deeply. "Recognition for what?" he muttered. The captain's voice returned, sounding slightly puzzled even as he read from whatever message had been relayed. "According to the lead F-35 pilot, they have identified a passenger on board by a historic call sign." Emily closed her eyes briefly, almost like someone hearing an old melody from a distant past. The captain continued. The call sign recognized was Viper. Daniel froze in his seat. Slowly, almost involuntarily, his eyes shifted toward the quiet woman sitting directly in front of him. And for the first time since the jets appeared, Emily Carter finally looked back over her shoulder. Not proudly, not defensively, just calmly. Because she knew something the rest of the plane was only beginning to understand. The sky remembers its own. The airplane cabin had gone completely silent. Even the quiet background hum of the engines seemed louder now that every passenger was listening to the captain's announcement echoing through the speakers. The word hung in the air like something fragile. Viper. Daniel Hargrove didn't move for several seconds. His eyes stayed locked on the back of the young woman's seat in front of him, as if his brain was trying to force the pieces together and failing. He had spent the last hour assuming she was just another quiet traveler, someone ordinary. Someone who should probably be more nervous about fighter jets escorting their flight. But the captain had just said the recognition came from the pilots themselves. Not from a passenger, not from the airline, from the pilots flying those F-35s outside the window. Slowly, Daniel leaned forward again, but this time there was no sarcasm in his voice, only disbelief. "You heard that, right?" he said quietly. Emily Carter didn't answer immediately. She was still looking out the window where the lead fighter jet had moved slightly closer to the aircraft. The pilot inside the cockpit couldn't be seen clearly through the reflective canopy, but the message had already been delivered. The sky had recognized her. Emily exhaled softly, almost like someone who had just heard a familiar song after many years. Her life had been quiet for a long time now. She had left the noise of military runways and high-pressure test flights behind years ago, trading them for something slower, something grounded. Most people she met had no idea who she used to be, and she preferred it that way. Fame in aviation circles was a strange thing. It rarely lasted long, and the people who chased it usually forgot why they loved flying in the first place. But some things didn't fade so easily. A call sign was one of them. Daniel leaned forward a little more. "They're talking about you, aren't they?" he said carefully. Emily finally turned slightly in her seat. Her calm expression hadn't changed much, but now there was a quiet acceptance in her eyes. Not pride, not embarrassment, just truth. "A long time ago," she said softly. Daniel blinked in confusion. "Wait, you're serious?" Around them, passengers were starting to whisper again. A few people had clearly heard the captain's announcement and were looking around the cabin, trying to guess who the mysterious Viper might be. No one immediately suspected the quiet woman in a pink shirt sitting by the window. She didn't look like a fighter pilot. She didn't look like someone who had once flown machines capable of breaking the sound barrier. She looked calm, grounded, ordinary. That was exactly what made the moment so powerful. Outside the window, the formation shifted slightly again. The lead jet rolled gently, almost like a subtle bow in the sky. Daniel stared out the window, then back at Emily, then out again. "Hold on," he said, rubbing his forehead. "You're telling me those jets are out there because of you?" Emily shook her head lightly. "Not because of me," she said. "Because of what we all did." Daniel didn't understand the answer, but before he could ask another question, the captain's voice returned to the intercom. This time the tone carried a hint of awe that he was no longer trying to hide. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've received additional information from the escorting pilots." The entire cabin leaned forward collectively, as if the plane itself was listening. "The lead F-35 pilot has confirmed that the call sign Viper belongs to a pilot who once flew emergency intercept missions during a severe Midwest storm system nearly a decade ago. During that incident, several aircraft lost communication and navigation systems. One pilot managed to guide multiple civilian flights out of dangerous airspace despite near-zero visibility. A quiet ripple moved through the cabin. Some passengers looked stunned. Others slowly turned toward Emily as if beginning to realize what the story meant. The captain continued, his voice steady but respectful. "According to the escorting pilots, that pilot's decisions prevented a chain reaction of mid-air collisions during the storm. Many aviators still study that flight in training simulations today." Daniel's mouth opened slightly. "You did that?" he whispered. Emily looked back toward the clouds again. The memory returned vividly now, the dark sky, the violent crosswinds, the radio chatter filled with panic as navigation systems flickered out across multiple aircraft. She had been younger then, flying an experimental response jet with only partial radar support. Most pilots would have retreated from the storm system. But Emily had stayed, not because she wanted recognition, because she knew someone needed to stay calm long enough to guide the others out. She remembered the voices on the radio that night, nervous captains trying to keep their passengers safe, controllers scrambling to regain signal, and the quiet moment when she realized the responsibility had landed on her shoulders. She hadn't hesitated, she simply listened to the sky, just like her father had taught her over those endless Iowa cornfields. Back in the present, Daniel shook his head slowly. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked. Emily smiled faintly. "Because the sky doesn't belong to one pilot," she said. "It belongs to everyone brave enough to fly through it." Outside the window, the F-35 formation tightened briefly. The soldiers standing atop the aircraft lifted their hands in another synchronized salute, their silhouettes sharp against the bright horizon. Inside the cabin, something had changed. The earlier tension was gone, replaced by quiet respect spreading from row to row. People weren't staring at Emily with shock anymore. They were seeing something deeper. A reminder that extraordinary strength often hides behind ordinary appearances. Daniel leaned back slowly into his seat, still absorbing the moment. His earlier confidence had completely vanished, replaced by humility he hadn't expected to feel today. Sometimes the loudest voices in a room assume they understand the people around them. But the truth is often sitting quietly nearby, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Emily looked out the window one last time as the jets began preparing to break formation. The sky stretched endlessly ahead, bright and peaceful again. She had spent years believing that part of her life was behind her. But moments like this reminded her that respect earned through courage never truly disappears. It simply waits for the next generation to notice it. And maybe that was the real message hidden inside this strange encounter above the clouds. You never know the full story of the person sitting beside you. The quietest people often carry the strongest histories, the hardest lessons, and the deepest courage. So the next time you meet someone who seems ordinary, remember this moment in the sky. Respect doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, just like Viper did.